I'll never forget the exact moment my entire world cracked open. Pack up your things. You're done here. That was the voice of Catherine Hale, my CEO, and until that moment, the woman I trusted more than anyone in the corporate world. She wasn't just my boss, she was my mentor. She was the one who told me I had the brains to make it in the cutthroat world of billion-dollar negotiations. But the same woman who built me up had just crushed me with a single sentence. And she had no idea that by firing me, she had signed the death warrant for her $80 million deal. Let me take you back. My name is Daniel Cross, 32 years old, corporate strategist, and for the last 6 years, I was Catherine's right-hand man. While she strutted into rooms dripping in designer power suits and sharp smiles, I was the one quietly holding everything together. Numbers, loopholes, and leverage points, I lived and breathed them. Catherine knew it too. She once told me, "You're the only person I can trust to spot landmines before I step on them." That's why it stung so much when trust turned into betrayal. Catherine Hale wasn't your typical CEO. People whispered her name like she was half goddess, half executioner. She could close a deal worth hundreds of millions before breakfast and then fire 3 executives by lunch without batting an eyelash. Investors adored her. Rivals feared her. Employees, well, let's just say walking into her office felt like stepping into a lion's den. But me? I wasn't afraid. We had this unspoken rhythm. She was the charismatic face, I was the brain in the shadows. Together, we were unstoppable. Or so I thought. It all started unraveling 3 months before she fired me. Catherine had her eyes on an $80 million merger deal with a rival tech firm, Brantham Industries. It was supposed to be her legacy project, the kind of deal that lands your photo on the cover of Forbes with the headline "Visionary CEO Doubles Empire Overnight." The problem? I saw cracks in it. Serious cracks. Hidden liabilities. Inflated valuations. Confidential whispers that Brantham's patents were under federal investigation. It wasn't just risky, it was a grenade waiting to explode. When I brought my concerns to Catherine, she didn't thank me. She didn't even listen. She laughed. "You worry too much, Daniel. This is how big players move. You either play the game or you get left behind." Her words sliced deeper than she realized. Because for years, I had been playing her game. I'd sacrificed weekends, relationships, even my health to keep her empire afloat. And suddenly, it felt like none of it mattered. At first, I tried to convince myself she was just stressed. Catherine thrived on risk, and maybe I was being too cautious. But the more I dug, the worse it got. Brantham's books were practically screaming fraud. If this deal went through, it wouldn't just cost the company money, it could collapse the entire empire. One night, I stayed late in the office, stacks of papers around me, spreadsheets glowing on my laptop. Catherine walked in, heels clicking like gunshots on the marble floor. She didn't look surprised to see me there. Instead, she leaned on my desk, crossed her arms, and smirked. "You're not sleeping much these days, are you, Daniel?" I tried to warn her again, laying out everything I'd uncovered. But this time, her expression hardened. "You don't understand. This deal isn't just about numbers. It's about power. And if you can't see that, maybe you don't belong here." The way she said it, it was the first time I felt something cold crawl up my spine. The next weeks were tense. Catherine started freezing me out of meetings I usually led. She reassigned my projects. Colleagues began whispering. Every time I walked past her office, her eyes followed me like I was already a ghost. And then on a rainy Friday morning, with the city skyline hidden behind fog, she called me into her office. "Daniel," she said, her voice clipped, "final. Pack up your things. You're done here. No explanation. No gratitude. 6 years erased in 6 words." I stared at her, numb. A storm raged in my chest, betrayal, rage, disbelief. But underneath it all was something sharper, something dangerous, the knowledge that Catherine Hale had just made the biggest mistake of her career. Because if she thought firing me would silence me, she was wrong. Dead wrong. She had no idea that I held the one card that could destroy her $80 million deal before it ever saw daylight. And for the first time, I felt the first flicker of something I'd never felt before: revenge. I thought getting fired would be the worst moment of my life. But the truth? The weeks leading up to it were worse. They were filled with a slow, suffocating, unraveling, the kind that makes you question whether you're paranoid, or whether the people you trust are already sharpening their knives. It started with the small things. For 6 years, I had been Catherine Hale's shadow. If she had a meeting, I was there. If she had a deal on the table, I was the one running the numbers. Yet suddenly, I was being left out. One Monday morning, I walked into the office ready for our weekly strategy briefing. Only, there wasn't one. My desk neighbor whispered that Catherine had already met with the executive board privately. No email. No notice. I wasn't invited. When I confronted her later, Catherine smiled like nothing was wrong. "Oh, Daniel, it was just a quick chat. Nothing worth your time." But she was lying. I could see it in the way her eyes flickered, in the way she avoided looking at my notes when I asked what had been discussed. For the first time, I wondered, was she deliberately shutting me out? Then came the favoritism. Catherine had always been strict, ruthless even, but she was fair. She never played favorites until Elliot showed up. Elliot was a junior analyst, barely 2 years in the company. Smart, sure, but unpolished. And yet, overnight, he was everywhere. Sitting in on board meetings. Speaking in pitches. Walking into Catherine's office like he owned the place. I overheard her one day, laughing in that warm, honeyed tone she usually saved for investors. "Elliot has such a sharp instinct. Reminds me of myself when I was his age." My chest tightened. For years, I had been her only one I can trust. And now, I was being replaced by a kid who couldn't even balance a cash flow sheet without help. The real cracks showed in the late nights. I often stayed long after the office emptied, running numbers, cross-checking contracts. It was how I discovered the first anomaly. One evening, I was working through Brantham Industries filings when I heard muffled voices from Catherine's office. The door was closed, but her voice carried sharp, hushed. I heard her say, "No, don't send it through email. Cash only. We can't leave a trail." My stomach dropped. Minutes later, her office door opened. Catherine stepped out, phone in hand, heels clicking like a metronome. When she saw me, she froze. For just a second, I saw the crack in her mask. Surprise, then irritation. "Still here?" she asked lightly, slipping her phone into her jacket. I nodded slowly. "Late numbers run." She gave me a smile so polished it hurt my teeth. "Don't work yourself to death, Daniel." And then she swept past me, her perfume lingering like smoke. I sat there in silence long after she left, my pulse hammering. Cash only. No trail. What deal was she making? Why was she hiding it? That's when the lies began stacking. She'd tell me she was flying to DC for investor meetings, but I'd catch wind from a contact that she'd been spotted in Chicago. She told the board we were financially rock solid, but my own deep dive into our accounts showed questionable withdrawals, hundreds of thousands moving in strange patterns. When I brought it up carefully, she cut me off with that ice blade tone. "Daniel, you're overthinking again. Do your job and leave the big picture to me." But how could I? Numbers don't lie. People do. Emotionally, it was eating me alive. I'd go home, drop my briefcase on the floor, and just sit in the dark staring at my hands. Was I imagining things? Was Catherine really betraying me, or was I just becoming paranoid after too many sleepless nights? Every memory of our years together, her mentorship, her praise, her loyalty clashed violently with the shadows I was seeing now. It was like watching a statue you'd worshipped your whole life start to crack, piece by piece. I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating properly. My friends noticed I wasn't myself, but how could I explain it? The woman I trusted most might be lying, stealing, and plotting against me. It sounded insane. And yet, deep down, I knew. Something was shifting. Something dark. The final red flag came the night I stayed later than usual, determined to find answers. I walked past Catherine's office and saw Elliot inside, the door slightly ajar. Papers spread across her desk, numbers scrawled in the margins. I froze. Those weren't company files. They were personal accounts. Offshore transfers. Shell companies. Documents with Catherine's signature. Before I could process it, Elliot looked up and saw me. He slammed the folder shut, eyes wide, like a thief caught in the act. Neither of us said a word. But in that moment, I realized something chilling. Catherine wasn't just pushing me aside. She was hiding something monumental. And Elliot wasn't just a favorite, he was in on it. I walked out that night with my head spinning. Betrayal wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was a storm forming on the horizon. I just didn't know yet that it was about to sweep me away. I wish I could say I was surprised when the truth finally hit me. But betrayal doesn't come like lightning. It builds like thunder in the distance, soft at first, then louder, closer, until it's shaking your chest. And when the storm finally broke, it didn't just ruin my career. It destroyed the illusion that Catherine Hale had ever cared about me at all. The day it happened started like any other. Grey skies outside, coffee in hand, the office buzzing with the hollow cheer of people pretending they weren't dead inside. But I could feel something off. Catherine's door had been closed since morning, her blinds drawn. Elliot had been slipping in and out all day, carrying folders like a loyal errand boy. By noon, whispers were spreading. Something big was happening. I didn't know it yet, but Catherine was already holding the knife she would use to cut me down. The betrayal revealed itself in the most humiliating way possible, a boardroom ambush. That afternoon, Catherine summoned the entire executive team. As always, I took my seat at her right side until she gave me a look that made my stomach turn. Cold. Distant. She stood at the head of the long glass table, Elliot at her side, and announced, "We're moving forward with the Brantham deal. And there are adjustments to leadership that need to be addressed." Adjustments? My pulse spiked. Then she dropped it like a guillotine. Effective immediately, Daniel Cross will be stepping down from his role as chief strategist. Elliot Chambers will be taking over. The room went dead silent. I felt the blood drain from my face. What? Catherine, this has to be a mistake. But she didn't even flinch. You've been raising unnecessary alarms, Daniel. Distracting the board with paranoia and conspiracy theories. It's time for fresh leadership, someone who understands where this company is headed. Her words sliced deeper than any blade. 6 years of loyalty, sacrifice, sleepless nights, and she framed me as dead weight. I tried to defend myself, to show the board the evidence I'd uncovered about Brantham's shady numbers. I laid out the discrepancies, the risks, the whispers of fraud. But Catherine had already poisoned the well. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with venom disguised as concern. Daniel has been under a lot of stress lately. I've been worried about his mental state. These claims, unfounded, exaggerated, are exactly why this transition is necessary. We can't let fear derail an $80 million opportunity. Mental state. That's when I realized. She wasn't just cutting me out. She was painting me as unstable, paranoid, ruining my reputation so no one would ever take me seriously again. And Elliot? He stood beside her, smug, eyes glittering with the kind of arrogance only betrayal can give. He had been feeding her everything. My late-night research, my suspicions, my warnings. All twisted, repackaged, used against me. It wasn't just favoritism. It was sabotage. The board voted that afternoon. My removal was unanimous. Just like that, I was stripped of everything I had built: my title, my influence, my seat at the table. I walked out of that room with my chest hollow and my hands shaking. Catherine didn't even look at me as I passed. To her, I was already a ghost. Back in my office, I shut the door and tried to breathe. Rage, heartbreak, disbelief, they all crashed into me at once. I thought of the late nights, the loyalty, the years I gave her without question. And for what? So she could use me as a stepping stone, then kick me aside when I dared to challenge her golden ticket? My eyes fell on the piles of documents I had collected: files, spreadsheets, contracts with red circles around the numbers that didn't add up. I had begged her to listen, to see the truth. Instead, she had branded me a liability and shoved me out the door. I pressed my fists to the desk, teeth grinding. She thought she had won. But she didn't know what I knew. She didn't know that buried in those documents was the very thing that could torch her $80 million deal before it ever closed. That night, I didn't sleep. I paced my apartment, replaying every moment in the boardroom, every smug glance from Elliot, every cold dismissal from Catherine. The heartbreak was real, but underneath it was something stronger, hotter. Revenge. Because Catherine Hale hadn't just betrayed me. She had underestimated me. And in the corporate world, underestimation is fatal. By morning, the decision was clear. I wasn't going to beg for my job back. I wasn't going to lick my wounds and disappear. I was going to bring her empire to its knees. And it would all start with the deal she thought would define her legacy. The deal I would make sure never saw daylight. The anger that first night after the boardroom ambush felt like a live thing inside me, hot, jittery, impossible to ignore. But anger alone is a dangerous fuel. It burns quick and clouds judgment. If this was going to be more than a tantrum, it had to be sharpened into something colder, strategy. For 2 days I did nothing. I let the humiliation wash over me, let the city crawl past my window like a movie I'd been edited out of. Friends called, I let them leave messages. I stared at the piles of papers I'd left in my office, my work, my life, proof of what I'd been trying to prevent, and felt very small. Catherine had already written the script where I was the unreliable one. Everyone would believe her version. My career was a burning fuse, and she had just tossed it into a field of dry grass. Then, on the third morning, something happened that changed everything. I went back to the office to collect a few personal items. The elevator smelled like lemon cleaner and stale ambition. The reception girl, someone I'd seen a dozen times but never really noticed, gave me a hesitant nod. As I passed the glass-walled boardroom, I paused. Through the blinds, I could see Catherine's silhouette, and next to her, Elliot, hunched over something on a tablet. They were laughing. Not the hard, practiced laugh of two colleagues closing a deal, but something softer, private, dangerous. I felt bile rise. I was halfway down the hall when the cleaning crew, an older man named Sal who'd been in the building forever, caught my arm. "You Daniel, right?" he said, voice rough with a lifetime of cigarettes. "They left a box in the supply room. Thought maybe you'd want it." He handed me the box like it was contraband. Inside were the things you don't expect to matter until they suddenly do: a stack of annotated reports I'd compiled during the Brantham audit, a thumb drive labeled in my handwriting, and wrapped in an envelope an old printed email thread I had forgotten I'd printed weeks ago. I hadn't even remembered putting that envelope there. I should have left. I should have thanked him and walked away. But something in me refused to let the paper go unread. I opened the envelope in the stairwell. The printed email was a single line, an offhand confirmation from an external consultant that I'd forwarded to Catherine: "We see red flags. Recommend further due diligence on Brantham patents." Below it, in raw, ugly bold, was a reply I'd never meant anyone else to see: Catherine's terse note: "Proceed. Don't delay. This is priority." It hit me like a physical blow. She'd seen the warning and deliberately disregarded it. Not only that, she'd labeled it priority. She knew. Then I plugged the thumb drive into my phone in the stairwell, hands steady for the first time in days. There were raw audio files, recordings from calls I'd made while trying to corroborate Brantham's claims. One file, buried in the pile, was a voicemail transcription from a law firm. It mentioned an ongoing federal inquiry into Brantham's patent assignments. The other files were Catherine's expense reports, tiny transfers to shell vendors, coded line items that didn't match any legitimate consulting work. All the humiliation, the betrayal, the sneers, compressed into a single, crystalline moment of clarity. I realized two things at once: Catherine had actively hidden material risk from the board, and she'd used me as the scapegoat to clear her path. She'd gambled the company for power and lied about it. That was the trigger. Not the firing. Not the betrayal itself. The trigger was proof that I hadn't been paranoid. The trigger was knowing she'd played with people's livelihoods, my livelihood, and had the hubris to think she could bury it with a lie. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They were steady, businesslike. For the first time since the ambush, I felt a cold, clear purpose. Revenge melted into responsibility. This wasn't just about me anymore. If Catherine's gamble succeeded, dozens of people would lose homes, pensions, reputations. I could either sit and watch the collapse, or I could pull the alarm. I left the building with the box under my arm and the recordings burning in my pocket. I didn't have a plan, at least, not a fully formed one. But I had something better: leverage. Evidence. The one thing Catherine assumed I no longer possessed. That night I did what I should have done the moment I saw the first red flag. I stopped being a soldier in her war and became my own general. I made a list, names of people who would care if the deal collapsed: a skeptical board member who valued compliance over glory, a compliance officer I'd once mentored in a drunken midnight confession, an old college friend now at the SEC I'd kept in touch with. I started mapping the vulnerabilities of the Brantham deal: the patent dates, the shell companies, the discrepancies in cash flow, and I began to see a route to veto. But the emotional shift was the hardest part. I had to stop feeling like the wounded man who'd been pushed off a cliff and start feeling like the architect of the parachute. That meant letting go of the fantasy of walking back into Catherine's office and demanding apologies. It meant acting quietly, intelligently, and with moral clarity. The person I had been, the loyal, invisible strategist who lived for Catherine's approval, was gone. In his place stood someone leaner, sharper, someone who had been forged in the heat of betrayal and cooled into resolve. By dawn, I had a plan in broad strokes. I would not storm the board with rage. I would use the very systems they trusted, compliance channels, auditors, regulatory contacts, to force a pause on the deal. I would make sure the questions were formal, documented, impossible to ignore. I would make the truth land on their laps in a way that left no room for Catherine's polished lies. It wouldn't be easy. It might destroy me. But the thought didn't scare me anymore. It energized me. Because when someone plays with $80 million like it's pocket change and hides the risk to feed their ego, they deserve to be stopped. And I had the tools to do it. The plan didn't come in a single flash. It was a series of small, precise moves, no theatrics, no melodrama, just the kind of clinical, patient work that wins wars you're not supposed to fight. I knew I couldn't yell the truth into the boardroom and expect them to listen. Catherine had already built a narrative that made me the unstable variable. So instead I built a different narrative, one they couldn't ignore. Step 1. Lock down the evidence. I started by cataloging everything on the thumb drive and the documents Sal had handed me. Dates. Email headers. Timestamps on calls. The shell company names that showed up in Catherine's expense reports. I cross-referenced transaction IDs with public corporate registries, tracing tiny transfers to shadow accounts registered in jurisdictions designed to hide ownership. It was tedious and exhausting, but every cross-check tightened the noose. I also needed something kinetic, something that would force an auditor to pause the deal. That came in the form of the patent assignments. Brantham's valuation hinged on key patents. If those patents were contested or improperly assigned, the whole $80 million valuation collapsed. I had already found a suspicious assignment date that didn't line up with the development timeline referenced in Brantham's own pitch documents. I put my energy into proving the mismatch, engineering logs, time-stamped internal memos, and a faded PDF of a lab notebook I'd pried out during my late nights. Each piece on its own was a pebble. Together they were a landslide. Step 2. Secure allies in places that mattered. I reached out quietly. The compliance officer Marisol was the first call. She owed me nothing, but she owed herself the truth. I slid her a copy of the spreadsheet with annotations and a neutral on-the-record summary, potential irregularities requiring due diligence. No accusations, just facts. It was enough to make her stop smiling in executive meetings and start paging through filings at home. Next was the skeptical board member I had once trusted to temper Catherine's bravado. He'd always been risk-averse, allergic to reputational exposure. I went in with a short brief and left it with him in a sealed envelope, the kind of thing you hand over only if you mean business. His response was slow and measured. "If any of this is true, nobody signs off until it's resolved," he said. Exactly what I needed. Step 3. Set the trap so that Catherine would trigger it herself. Catherine loved control. She also loved momentum. If I could stall every move she made toward a closing date under the guise of due diligence, she'd either slow down or try to steamroll compliance. Either option would create the crack I needed. I arranged for formal requests, a compliance review initiated by Marisol, a technical audit flagged by the skeptical board member, an anonymous tip to an external legal firm asking them to confirm patent assignment histories. Each request was dry, bureaucratic, and perfectly kosher. No fingerprints. No melodrama. Step 4. Bait the narrative. In private, I leaked small, verifiable facts to 2 journalists I trusted from my pre-Catherine days, people who cared about accuracy more than sensationalism. A single line in a well-placed piece about due diligence concerns would make the board uncomfortable in front of investors. It would make Catherine's phone start ringing with the same question in every voice: "Are you sure?" I didn't want headlines that screamed treachery. I wanted a persistent background hum of doubt, like a mosquito you can't swat. Step 5. Prepare for the counterattack. Catherine would not fold gracefully. She had already shown she could weaponize charm, cash, and narrative. So I outfitted myself for the inevitable smear campaign. I took screenshots of my own communications, transmitted copies to a secure cloud I controlled, and emailed timestamp summaries to a lawyer I'd worked with during a side project. If they tried to claim I'd fabricated anything, I would already have legally verifiable records proving otherwise. All this had to be invisible. If Catherine suspected a threat, she would seal up, circle the wagons, and bury everything deeper. So I moved like a ghost, messages through old colleagues, hand-delivered packets from benign sources, bureaucratic motions that triggered internal audits without pointing directly at me. Throughout it all, Catherine acted like nothing was wrong. In public she was magnetic, more dazzling than ever: glossy interviews, congratulatory emails, dinners with investors that ended in toasts. She posted photos of herself at charity galas, smiling into the camera as if legacy was already carved into marble. Elliot strutted around the office like the heir apparent, eyes bright with the knowledge he'd been promoted to safety, but in private his head jerked whenever a compliance ping came in. I watched him study his phone like a guilty man studying footprints. Those pings were my little victories. A formal request for additional patent documentation. A demand for proof of consultant engagements. A polite, professional request to see the raw data behind Brantham's biggest claims. Each bureaucratic ping lengthened the timeline, and with every delay, the momentum Catherine depended on wobbled. But the tension only rose. Catherine grew impatient, visible in the way she lashed out at meetings, in the way her emails became clipped and menacing. She began tightening her inner circle, and Elliot's loyalty hardened into panic. At any moment she might take an aggressive step, rush the board, leverage investors, or, worst of all, bury the evidence by purging files and tightening access. That was the gamble I was playing against. Would the board pull the emergency brake in time, or would Catherine accelerate hard enough to pass the point of no return? The calendar loomed. The closing date for the Brantham deal inched closer like a metronome, counting down to either victory or ruin. I had laid the groundwork. I had witnesses and documents and the slow, methodical machinery of corporate accountability starting to whir. Now it was a waiting game with explosive stakes. The worst part was that Catherine still smiled like she owned everything. She believed she was winning. And for the first time since she fired me, I believed I might just be able to prove her wrong. By then the paper trail was a train I'd already set on its tracks. Marisol, the compliance officer, had delivered her formal audit request under the authority of a newly convened subcommittee. The skeptical board member had quietly pushed for an external technical review. The journalists I'd nudged ran a cautious, impeccably sourced piece that morning about unanswered questions in Brantham's patent history. Investors woke up reading it with coffee in hand. The air smelled like ozone and coffee. Catherine arrived at the office in 2 bright heels and practiced calm, but there was a tremor in the way she smiled as she walked to the boardroom. Elliot shadowed her, phone glued to his palm. They believed still that momentum was theirs. They didn't know the audit report had already landed on a regulator's desk. They didn't know the external firm's preliminary memo, sent to the board at dawn, called the patent chain into question. They didn't know the SEC contact I'd pinged had opened a formal inquiry based on the same inconsistencies I'd flagged. We filed into the boardroom. The light slashed across the glass table. Catherine took the head, poised and predatory. The agenda was simple: finalize the Brantham closing. She started with slides, slick branding, glossy projections, a CEO's dream speech about growth and legacy. Glasses clinked on the table. Investors dialed in. Elliot smiled like a boy waiting for applause. Then Marisol spoke, voice steady but cold. Before we proceed, we must address the findings of the preliminary audit. She placed a thick folder on the table. Their faces, in that moment, read like a crime scene photograph. Catherine's smile faltered. The external firm's memo was clinical, remorseless. It laid out the patent assignment discrepancies, dates that didn't match development logs, signatures that looked photocopied, shell entities whose beneficial owners traced to the same handful of anonymous accounts. It showed consultant invoices with vague line items and transfer paths leading to places nobody reputable used. It asked, plainly, for a suspension of the deal until a full forensic review could be completed. Silence fell. The investors on the call cleared their throats, suddenly very interested in their fiduciary duty. Catherine's voice was measured at first. These are procedural matters. We will address them in due course. I assure you. Not in due course, interrupted the skeptical board member, his tone a scalpel. The memo recommends a halt. Given the potential regulatory exposure, we cannot proceed. She leaned forward, eyes flashing, but not with the calm of a victor. This is a delay tactic. I am confident. Confidence is not compliance, Marisol said. We need documentation. We need proof the patents were properly assigned. We need to know where money flowed and why. Elliot's phone vibrated. He looked up like a man who'd just realized someone else had the map. Catherine's jaw clenched. For the first time, I saw fear flicker across her face, just a sliver, human and ugly. Then the emails began. The journalist's piece had already circulated. A legal counsel representing a major investor phoned in with questions about reputational risk. The regulator's inquiry, now public on the docket, put an official blot on the transaction. It was one bureaucratic knock after another, each amplifying the last. The board voted to suspend the deal pending full review. Unanimous. Catherine stood, face ashen for the first time in my presence. Her hands trembled, fingers grazing the edge of the table like someone trying to hold onto a cliff. Elliot's posture collapsed in a way that made him look suddenly adolescent, the grand plan reduced to a scraped knee. Minutes later, as the room emptied, Catherine caught my eye. For a split second, 1,000 unspoken histories, mentorship, late nights, favors traded like currency flashed between us. Her lips moved, forming a word that sounded like apology but landed like accusation. "You shouldn't have done this," she whispered. The voice was small, stunned. "You could have destroyed everything." I felt the room tilt. The animal part of me wanted to stand and shout every betrayal into the fluorescent lights. Instead I sat, breathed, and watched her unravel with a clarity that made the victory feel both sweet and terrible. I had brought her down with evidence, with due process, no theatrics, no blood on the carpet. It was surgical, clean, irrevocable. Outside, investor calls turned into withdrawal notices, cautious letters turned into inquiries, and Catherine's phone that had once rung with offers started ringing with subpoenas and counsel requests. The glossy PR statements she'd drafted were rendered useless by a single line in a regulator's memo. Preliminary evidence suggests misrepresentation of patent ownership and potential undisclosed related party transactions. Elliot packed his desk in silence that afternoon. He moved like a man trying to hide guilt under clothes. Catherine's office emptied into boxes marked personal effects. The empire, which had always seemed immovable, creaked and shifted. But the moment of triumph was not without cost. My victory had not been a public execution so much as a quiet, bureaucratic collapse. People lost bonuses. Careers stalled. Families would feel the ripple. I had stopped the $80 million folly, but I also set off a chain reaction no one could have predicted. As I walked past the lobby, the janitor Sal gave me a nod so small it could have been mistaken for kinship or pity. A journalist I'd never met asked me for a comment. I refused. I didn't want my voice to be the one that closed the coffin. Evidence had done that. Paperwork had done that. Reality, lined with timestamps and signatures, had done that. That night, as the city lights blurred into a smear outside my apartment, I allowed myself one honest emotion, the hollow victory of a man who had saved a company from ruin but had also detonated the life he once had. Catherine's name would now be a headline tangled with words like investigation and misconduct. Elliot's career was likely finished. I had vetoed her $80 million deal, and in doing so, I'd rewritten both our legacies. But the story wasn't over. There were still hearings to come, reputations to be tried in public, and a small, private reckoning I'd been keeping for myself. The storm had broken. The shore was strewn with wreckage. And somewhere in the wreckage, I could hear the quiet, dangerous whisper of what revenge had cost and what it had freed me to become. The days after Catherine's empire collapsed felt surreal, as though the air itself carried the echoes of something massive that had fallen. News outlets ran relentless cycles. $80M deal implodes amid fraud investigation. Investors scrambled to distance themselves. Whispers spread through the industry, at first cautious, then gleeful, as rivals dissected her arrogance. Catherine had always carried herself like a queen, untouchable in her glass tower. But once the investigation began, the board moved swiftly. She was stripped of her position, her name quietly erased from the company directory. And Elliot? He vanished in disgrace, his carefully polished reputation cracking under the weight of his own complicity. The Brantham acquisition wasn't just dead, it was a case study in corporate failure, dissected in business schools before the year was out. For me, though, the silence after the storm was complicated. I had done what I set out to do, I had vetoed her deal, stopped the $80 million betrayal in its tracks. But in the quiet of my apartment, the victory hummed with both pride and melancholy. Revenge doesn't restore what was lost, it only balances the scales. And balancing the scales always comes with a cost. Still, there was one thing Catherine never expected, the respect I would earn. The board, wary at first, now saw me differently. "You saved us from ruin," one of them admitted in a closed meeting. The external auditors recommended me for an interim leadership role, citing my diligence and foresight. I hadn't just exposed Catherine's scheme, I had proven myself capable of steering the company through fire. And word traveled fast. Journalists who once had no reason to know my name began calling me the whistleblower who stopped an $80 million lie. Former colleagues, even ones who had ignored me when Catherine was in power, reached out with congratulations. Some were sincere, some opportunistic, but all of them now looked at me with respect instead of dismissal. As for Catherine, the poetic justice unfolded slowly, painfully. Her fall wasn't dramatic like in the movies, no handcuffs on the evening news, no screaming breakdown in the lobby. Instead, it was the erosion of everything she valued. The SEC inquiry dragged on for months, bleeding her finances with legal fees. Old allies distanced themselves, whispering that they had always had doubts. Invitations stopped coming. The woman who once commanded boardrooms with a flick of her wrist was now reduced to fighting for her professional survival in windowless legal offices. But the cruelest irony? Catherine had taught me everything she knew. Negotiation, strategy, how to see 3 moves ahead. She made me sharp enough to survive, sharp enough to take her down. Her downfall was crafted with the very tools she had handed me. That, I think, is the truest revenge, when the betrayer is destroyed not by an outside force, but by the very person they once underestimated. One evening, months later, I ran into her by chance. She was stepping out of a courthouse, her face drawn, her heels scuffed, her aura dimmed. She saw me. For a flicker of a second, the old fire returned, then disappeared. She looked away, as if even holding my gaze reminded her of everything she had lost. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. My silence was louder than any accusation. Because in the end, she fired me to protect her empire, and I vetoed the very deal that could have saved her legacy. That is poetic justice. Now I want to turn this moment to you, the one watching this story unfold. Have you ever faced betrayal from someone you trusted, someone who thought they could use you, discard you, or walk over you without consequence? Have you ever dreamed of the moment the scales finally balanced, when the person who wronged you tasted the weight of their own actions? If so, tell me your story in the comments. Share it, because stories like these aren't just entertainment. They're proof that betrayal doesn't get the last word. And if you want more stories of justice served cold, of the underestimated rising stronger, make sure to subscribe. Because sometimes, the best revenge, is simply letting the betrayer choke on the weapon they forged against you. High voltage sign: she fired me. I vetoed her $80 million deal. And in the end, she wasn't just defeated, she was destroyed by her own lessons, sharpened in my hands.